Hello. So in this video lecture, it's the third in the chapter of culture. I want to talk about aspects of non-material culture, or sometimes referred to as symbolic culture. In the previous lecture, I was talking about ethnocentrism and cultural relativism and asking you, I think there was an assignment that asked you to explain basically a good and a bad about each of those, an asset and a liability, a pro and a con. In this lecture, I want to talk about the different elements of, or the different parts, if you will, of non-material culture. So remember, the culture has two elements. You have the stuff and the non-stuff. Non-material culture really, I would argue, is what probably motivates us to sort of judge others. We probably are less critical of different cultures based on their stuff. We may even want to collect it. But when we get to considering, or when we observe how people organize their life, how they act or believe, that's when we start to become a bit more judgmental. So for our purposes, we're going to break down non-material culture into these, well, about 5 different categories. You have symbols, and symbols are simply markers generally standing for ideas, right? Gestures, and gestures would be an example of body language, personal space, maybe literally hand gestures. I know that when missionaries travel abroad, and I think military does this too, they learn about, different hand gestures not to make. It's one of the things that law enforcement gets involved in when they're studying gangs, because gangs actually act as a sort of as a subculture, right? So we do a lot of communicating with gestures. Language, and in this case, language is really important because language, some anthropologists argue that language is what separates the humans from the animals, because your dogs and your cats, right, they can communicate with you. They have a way of communicating, and they may even have like different meows and different barks for different things, but that doesn't from our purposes, that doesn't qualify as a language, because language allows us to accumulate ideas, and to pass on our ideas intergenerationally, right? I mean, your dog can tell you, for instance, that they're hungry, that they need to go out, but they're limited to the present. They can't really explain what their day was like when you weren't home, what they're afraid of for tomorrow. They can't ask you, are you going to be gone from work tomorrow? I pick my dog up from doggy daycare, and it's always so anticlimactic. He just won't tell me nothing about what happened. Historians also point out that really civilization or societies didn't really begin to grow and become complex until people had started recording things. And the first things they recorded, according to some historians, were numbers, so that they could count trade. So language is critical, and specifically a written language is critical. That's what makes that is the building block of society or culture. So language, I hope you can see this in the right way. Here's another shape you're going to see. And what it is it's 3 bubbles, and they're all connected. Language is what allows us to share or to create the next part of non-material culture, and those are values. Values is another way, and in the quiz question, and I'll say another word for values, another word is ideas. Ideas. Language allows us to share abstract ideas about what is right, wrong, good, bad, beautiful, and ugly, the way the world should be, what's wrong with the world, your opinion of people. It's only because we have language. And ideas then, theoretically, are supposed to inform our behavior. Generally, we say we express what we think is right, and we act according to that. This is so important. This relationship between doing what we say, and between saying what we think is important and doing what we say, that we actually have a word for people who don't, who say one thing and do something different. We call those people hypocrites, and we don't much care for hypocrites. And the reason we don't is because they are violating this third element of culture, and that is norms. The norm, the expected behavior in our culture is, if you say you're going to do it, you do it, right? If you say you like chocolate, then you order chocolate ice cream. You don't order vanilla ice cream. And norms are important, and this is a really important point, really important point. Norms are important because they make life predictable, right? People are expected to follow the rules, and pretty much we operate constantly on the expectation that other people will follow the rules, meet the standards of expectation. We drive on the right hand side of the street because we take for granted that other people are going to drive on their right hand side of the street. We go when the light turns green because we take for granted that people will stop when their light turns green. And when they don't, right, when they don't conform with the social rules, this creates all kinds of havoc. And that havoc is what we would call a sanction. We punish people for not following the rules. We judge them. It may be a formal sanction, it may be an informal sanction, but nonetheless, we judge them. We may give them a formal ticket. We may call them a nasty name. We might write about them in the history books, whatever. But there are consequences, right, for following the rules. Now, I want to back up and talk a little bit more specifically about norms, right? Norms are important because they make life predictable, but not all norms are equally important. We have in our culture a hierarchy. We have like a scale. At the bottom of the scale are what are called folkways. And these folkways are patterns of behavior, expected patterns of behavior that are really thought of as just making life run smoothly. These would be things that and here's another thing, we mostly only notice this stuff when it's not met, when people do something different. So for the most part, the expected patterns of behavior, you hold the door open, you don't slam it in somebody's face, oh golly gee, I'm trying to think of some good examples. If we were in a face-to-face class, you would expect me to come, you'd expect me to be to class, and you would take that for granted that your teacher's going to show up to class until they don't show up to class, because it's when they violate the social rule. We go through life. You assume that the cashier is going to give you proper change. You assume that the milk you buy isn't going to be sour. We may take all of these assumptions, all of these expected patterns of behavior for granted. So folkways are sort of I like to think of the ones like, I don't know, maybe you turn on your signal, whatever. When a norm is written down, we say that's codified. And a codified norm, a written down expected behavior, that's what we call a law. And there are formal sanctions, so you might get a ticket or a citation when you don't conform to codified norms. And then there would be like this middle group of norms. We call them mores, right? They're a little bit more important. They're less about being polite. They're more about maybe some of the other values in our culture, like perhaps personal property rights, the democratic process, right? But here's another thing. What's really important to emphasize is theoretically, and this is what the cultural relativism is about, is that theoretically, all our behaviors are supposed to be motivated by an idea, by a belief. They're not just random, but there's this connection between the two, between what we say, what we believe to be true, and how we act. The most profound kind of norm, are what are called taboos. And some anthropologists argue that there really are only a couple different taboos. But maybe you've heard of, sometimes there's a couple taboos that are like considered cultural universal, that almost all cultures have these taboos. For instance, all cultures have something that is often called an incest taboo. And an incest taboo is really just rules about who can have sex with who and when, but they differ. So in other words, all cultures have rules, but the precise nature of those rules change. Even in the United States, that some states have like age of consent of 16, some states have age of consent of 18. So but all states have an age of consent. It just is how they vary. Another one is cannibalism and murder. And those fall under the category of taboo. But even with those taboos, there are some variables, right? Well, certainly for ending another person's life, we might use a different language when we allow, say, the military or the government, right, to execute somebody. We don't even call that murder. We call that capital punishment, right? So, but if I were to just walk across the street and shoot my neighbor and then eat my neighbor, well, that would be that's not, you know, I don't even know what words to say. So the reason these behaviors are considered taboos is because they would cause such a radical disruption of society. This society would like fall apart, right? If it was acceptable for all of us just to go out and kill our neighbors and eat them. This might remind you of the movie Purge. Sometimes students, I've never seen the movie The Purge, but students have made reference to like what's called a norm holiday, and that's when the rules change for a brief period of time. Other examples of norm holidays would have been like Mardi Gras or I don't know, various things like that. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. Norms are important because they make life predictable.